Before we start with the talks, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the unceded lands where the law school and university are located, and that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So today we have two speakers speaking about cosmetic surgery reforms in Australia, considerations for doctors and patients. Our first speaker is Dr. Owen Bradfield. He is the Chief Medical Officer of the Medical Indemnity Protection Society. Owen is a dual qualified medical practitioner and health lawyer with nearly 20 years experience in medical and legal practice. He's a regular contributor, Helen, so we're very happy to welcome back again. And our second speaker is Dr. Alisha Randhawa, who is a research officer at the Body Image and Eating Disorder Research Group in the Department of Neuroscience at Monash University. And Alisha's work explores the causes and novel treatments of body image-related disorders. So the standard format that we follow for these Helen seminars is we'll have Owen speak for 20 minutes. We'll then pass over to Alisha for 20 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes of questions at the end. So feel free to hold on to your questions until the end there, or if you want to articulate them early, you can put them in the chat box as we go through. So that's it for me. I'd like to hand it over to Owen. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. Thanks again, Chris, for the warm introduction, and also thank you for the invitation to present this afternoon. And thanks to everyone for joining Alisha and I in this presentation in which we talk about cosmetic surgery and the reforms that have so far been enacted. But before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we're all gathered this afternoon and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I'd like to extend that respect to any First Nations people who are joining. So, as Chris mentioned, I'm the Chief Medical Officer of the Medical Indemnity Protection Society. And so in my current and past roles in the medical defence insurance industry, I've assisted practitioners who've received claims and complaints relating to cosmetic surgery. I've seen complications, I've seen poor outcomes following cosmetic surgery, and many of these claims, I have to say, often related to allegations of poor cosmetic practices or poor consent processes or sometimes inadequate training. I've also been involved in the response to both the targeted and public consultation phases of the independent review that have led to the current reforms. And so today I'll be outlining what some of those significant reforms are in the cosmetic surgery industry, but also talking a little bit about how we got there. So I guess many of you might recall back in 2021 and 2022, there were various media investigations that aired on 60 Minutes and Four Corners. And these reports showed sort of confronting social media video footage of some of the disturbing practices that were taking place inside cosmetic surgery operating theatres. These reports and videos purportedly showed procedures being performed without adequate sterile technique. In some cases, people dancing during significant and potentially dangerous procedures. Procedures being performed other than in licensed day procedure units. Inaccurate representations of before and after images on social media. Allegedly some documents being forged, and also social media influencers being offered free treatments in exchange for positive reviews. What it also showed was that for many patients who had suffered adverse outcomes, they were also being silenced through, or felt silenced through, the use of non-disclosure agreements. And so much of the evidence of these practices came from unhappy patients, but also from former employees and two nursing staff in particular who claimed to witness many of these practices. And so it was these stories and these reports that really formed the catalyst for change. And so as a result of these and other allegations, regulators intervened. And in November 2021, an independent review was commissioned by AHPRA and the Medical Board of Australia. And so after a period of consultation, the findings were publicly released in August 2022, along with 16 recommendations for reform, all of which were accepted by AHPRA and the Medical Board. And the review uncovered a number of specific challenges facing the cosmetic surgery space that led to the review describing cosmetic surgery as a health market disruptor. So what it found was that there were a range of medical practitioners providing cosmetic surgery across different specialties and registration types. So some were generally registered, others had specialist registration. Some were using different titles, and many had membership or were members of a vast array of professional organisations. The review also showed that Medicare items, because they're not available for purely aesthetic cosmetic surgery, general practitioners weren't involved in referring patients to specific specialist surgeons. And it also showed that because purely aesthetic cosmetic surgery is not offered by the public health system or covered by private health insurance, existing systems that tended to ensure that patients accessed care from appropriately qualified medical practitioners didn't exist or didn't apply in cosmetic surgery. And so the review recognised that this posed a number of regulatory challenges. And so in addition, the review found that AHPRA and the Medical Board, who commissioned this independent review, were just a small part of a very complex and multifaceted and multi-jurisdictional system that regulates cosmetic surgery in Australia. And as with many other aspects of our health system, many of the regulation was a disjointed patchwork of Commonwealth and state or territory-based laws and regulations, which resulted in not only duplication, but also gaps in regulation. And so as outlined in this diagram, which is taken from the review, AHPRA and the Medical Board regulate individual practitioners who might undertake cosmetic surgery, but there are many other laws, agencies, and standards that regulate other aspects of cosmetic surgery. And so, for example, state and territory laws require certain procedures to be carried out only in certain types of facilities. So, for example, here in Victoria, liposuction that involves removal of more than 200 mils of fat can only be performed in a registered facility, and cosmetic surgery can only be carried out in a registered day hospital or day procedure centre. Other state and territory laws regulate private health facilities, including private hospitals. There's also state and territory health complaints entities that have similar but sometimes different powers to those of AHPRA and the national boards. Standards for accreditation of health facilities is governed by the Australian Council for Safety and Quality in Healthcare. And then there's the TGA that regulates medicines and devices, and the ACCC that regulates consumer laws under the Australian Consumer Law. So there's this patchwork of multiple different regulations and agencies across the Commonwealth and the states. And so as a result of this investigation, a suite of reforms was enacted across 4 broad areas. So there were new guidelines for cosmetic surgery and advertising. A system of cosmetic surgery endorsement was developed, and amendments to the national law that protect the title surgeon have also been passed. And so the first area of reform related to, and I guess the area that most directly impacts on practitioners is the creation of very specific guidelines that seek to set minimum standards and expectations regarding the practice of cosmetic surgery. So these guidelines were developed by the Medical Board of Australia, and they were developed under Section 39 of the Health Practitioner Regulation National Law Act, or also known as the National Law. And they aim to inform registered practitioners, medical practitioners and the community about what the board expects of doctors who perform cosmetic surgery. They seek to strengthen and complement existing codes of guidelines, including the Medical Board's Code of Conduct, and also existing guidance on telehealth consultations. So I don't intend to describe all of the reforms in detail, but I will touch on some of the most important and controversial areas. And I apologise in advance. It's what I'm going to outline is quite descriptive, so I'm just going to step through in summary form what the main thrust of these reforms are. So firstly, this guidance seeks to define cosmetic surgery. And so cosmetic refers to procedures that seek to revise or change the appearance, colour, texture, structure or position of normal bodily features, with the dominant purpose of achieving what the patient perceives to be a more desirable appearance. And so this contrasts with reconstructive surgery, which, although it can sometimes incorporate aesthetic or cosmetic techniques, it aims to restore form and function as well as normality. So surgery and procedures that have a medical justification and for which the intention is to, treat pathology, even if it may lead to an improvement in appearance, are specifically excluded from these suites of reforms. Also, in terms of definitions, the guidance seeks to separate cosmetic surgery from non-surgical cosmetic procedures. So it simply defines cosmetic surgery as involving cutting beneath the skin, whereas non-surgical cosmetic procedures do not. So an example of a cosmetic surgery would include breast augmentation, abdominoplasty, liposuction and fat transfer, whereas non-surgical cosmetic procedures might involve Botox or fillers. And the guidance also specifically calls out that gender affirmation treatment is not considered cosmetic surgery. So having defined what cosmetic surgery is for the purposes of these reforms, the guidance then goes on to talk about a number of different aspects of cosmetic surgery. And so the first aspect is assessment of patient suitability. So the guidance says that the medical practitioner who performs the surgery must assess all patients for underlying psychological conditions such as body dysmorphic disorder, which may make the patient an unsuitable candidate for surgery. The guidelines recommend that the practitioner doing the assessment must use a validated psychological screening tool. And I know Alisha is going to talk about this in more detail during her part of the presentation. But the guidance says that the outcome of all these assessments must be clearly documented in the patient's record. And if the screening tool indicates that the patient might have a significant underlying psychological issue that might make them an unsuitable candidate for surgery, then they should be referred to a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or a GP who works independently of that practitioner. Another significant and controversial change to the expectations of medical practitioners performing cosmetic surgery is that all patients seeking cosmetic surgery must have a referral, preferably from their usual GP, but if that's not possible, then from any other GP or specialist medical practitioner who again is independent of the practitioner performing the surgery. And interestingly, it requires that the person who does the referring or the referral should not themselves be someone who undertakes cosmetic surgery or non-surgical cosmetic procedures. The guidelines then set out in significant detail some of the expectations regarding the pre- and post-operative management of patients. So in summary, all cosmetic surgery must be preceded by at least 2 preoperative consultations, and at least one of those must be an in-person consultation. The practitioner performing the cosmetic surgery is responsible for the patient's overall care, and that includes arranging post-operative follow-up if that practitioner isn't themselves available. Postoperatively, patients must receive written information about what the procedure was that was performed, the range of expected postoperative symptoms or outcomes, including complications and side effects, and the contact details for the practitioner performing the surgery so the patient can contact them should they be experiencing any problems or difficulties. I'll touch on non-disclosure agreements a little later as well, but the guidance also states that non-disclosure agreements entered into with patients, although not banned in the guidelines, must clearly state that patients can still complain to health regulators, including AHPRA and the HCCC. There's also requirements around accredited facilities, which I've touched on previously. All cosmetic surgery must be performed in a facility that is accredited by an agency that is approved by the Australian Commission for Safety and Quality in Healthcare, and facilities must be appropriately staffed and equipped to manage the possible complications and emergencies that may arise from cosmetic surgery. The guidelines also go into a significant detail about various financial matters. So in particular, the offering of discounts or inducements to patients or to social media influencers is banned, as are financial loan schemes or buy now, pay later products, or encouraging patients to use their superannuation, which have the effect of encouraging vulnerable people to access cosmetic surgery. And then finally, there's very detailed guidance around consent. And so the guidelines state that consent must not be sought from patients until a face-to-face consultation with the practitioner performing the cosmetic surgery has occurred. There must be a cooling off period of at least 7 days between the giving of patient consent and any surgery taking place. And in the case of young people under the age of 18, that period is 3 months rather than 7 days. And the practitioner performing the cosmetic surgery must provide realistic, plain language, written and verbal information to allow patients to make informed decisions. And that information must include information about what the surgery is, so the what, where, how, why, and the risks of the surgery. It must also include information about the practitioner themselves performing the surgery. So it must state their name, their registration number, the type of registration that they hold, their level of experience, any other qualifications that they have. And also the guidelines set out in detail the sorts of information that should be provided in relation to costs. So not just the costs of the procedure, but also the costs of any devices, any medication, any follow-up costs, the cost of any other practitioners that might be involved in the patient's treatment, so assistants or anaesthetists, as well as information about how patients can access refunds. So there's a lot of information to cover there. And I'm happy to answer any questions later on, should they arise. I'm now going to turn to the second aspect of the reforms, which are the new advertising guidelines. And so the independent review identified a number of problems with the cosmetic industry that put consumers at particular risk of information asymmetry. And so the report identified that there was a lack of objective and unbiased information available to many patients about the training and qualifications of practitioners performing their surgery. It found that the entirely elective nature of cosmetic surgery meant that advertising played a more significant role in creating a desire or demand for services that were not based purely on health need. And also that social media was used extensively as a tool to reach and influence consumers, especially young consumers. And so together, the review felt that further tightening of advertising guidelines was required. And so prior to the review, there were guidelines already existed that sought to regulate how practitioners should advertise regulated health services. But the updated advertising guidelines go a step further. And so they seek to uphold honest, balanced, realistic and informative advertising that protects the dignity of patients and seeks to discourage unnecessary or inappropriate cosmetic surgery that might otherwise downplay the seriousness of the surgery and the risks of the surgery. And so, again, the guidelines require that information about cosmetic surgery must include the medical practitioner's registration number, their type of registration, their recognised specialty, and any field of specialty practice, if that's relevant. It must also be, any information must also be balanced and realistic and must include information about risks. And it's quite an eye-opener to read the document to see some of the words that it specifically calls out as saying advertising must not include. So these include words, colloquial terms such as boob job, tummy tuck, designer vagina, Barbie, or transformation. It also seeks to ban incentives such as offering discounts to patients. From the guidelines, it appears that some practitioners have offered discounted airfares, accommodation, or spa treatments as part of a cosmetic surgery package. It also seeks to ban the bundling of cosmetic surgery with other products such as facelifts and fillers as an all-in-one. And it also seeks to ban the giving of gifts or prizes. The guidelines go on to say that the use of social media influencers or ambassadors can perpetuate unrealistic expectations, and that the content published by these influencers or ambassadors is considered to pose a particular risk to young people due to the nature of the audience on social media. And so therefore practitioners who might enter into agreements with these influencers or ambassadors are responsible for advertising content that those ambassadors or influencers deliver. Goes on to talk about the use of single images and that they should be used sparingly, particularly when the images are likely to give the impression that it represents the outcome of surgery that might be misleading. And so, and it also talks about that advertising must not include any gratuitous nudity, idealized or sexualized images. So there's a lot of detail. I've sought to sort of summarize the thrust of these advertising guidelines. And it's my understanding from my conversations with people within AHPRA, but also from my own claims experience, that since these new advertising guidelines commenced, AHPRA has been actively auditing online content for compliance and sending warning letters to practices that might not be complying with these guidelines. And so regulatory action at this stage is only taken against practices or practitioners that don't comply with the warning letters. And so that takes me to the next area of reform, and that relates to cosmetic surgery endorsement. So generally, a registration endorsement recognises that a practitioner has an extended scope of practice in a particular area because they've obtained a specific qualification that's been approved by the board. And so this already exists, for example, for medical practitioners that want to perform acupuncture. And so any program of study that might lead to a qualification in cosmetic surgery would need to be accredited before an endorsement could be provided. And the accrediting authority is the Australian Medical Council. So it's the intended benefit of an endorsement is that it would provide it would set clear minimum standards of training and ensure that practitioners have the necessary knowledge and skills to competently and safely practice cosmetic surgery. The process would also allow consumers to identify which practitioners have an endorsement, because the endorsement would be listed on the public register. So practitioners would be permitted to advertise that they have or hold an endorsement in cosmetic surgery if they've completed the course leading to endorsement, and those without an endorsement would be prohibited from claiming that they have an endorsement. So that's important. So essentially, the way the national law operates is that it seeks to regulate what practitioners hold themselves out as being able to do. It doesn't necessarily seek to regulate what practitioners can actually do themselves. So having an endorsement wouldn't permit a practitioner. So having an endorsement simply permits a practitioner to say that they have an endorsement. It doesn't mean that not having an endorsement means you can't perform cosmetic surgery. And so this registration standard came into effect on the 1st of July last year. And so far, there are no approved qualifications available that will lead to an endorsement. And as far as I'm aware, at this stage, no applications have been received, although it's been a month or so since I last received an update. But once an area of practice endorsement is available, then all practitioners performing cosmetic surgery must tell their patients whether or not they have an endorsement. So this is part of, I guess, a longer-term strategy to try and lift the minimum standards when it comes to cosmetic surgery and the qualifications that the public might expect to see practitioners hold who are performing cosmetic surgery. And so the final and most recent area of reform in cosmetic surgery relates to title protections. And so, as I mentioned, to understand the importance of this reform, it's necessary to understand a little bit about the purpose and limitations of the national law. So, as I said, the national law sort of seeks to regulate what practitioners are allowed to call themselves. But AHPRA and the Medical Board are much more limited in being able to directly regulate a practitioner's scope of practice. That is what practitioners are allowed to do. So medical practitioners who don't hold specialist registration can't hold themselves out as a registered specialist or claim to be qualified to practice in a registered specialty. And so the problem until these reforms were enacted was that cosmetic surgery wasn't a recognised medical specialty, and so it wasn't something that was protected. It wasn't a title that was protected. And so proponents of this reform argued that it would better inform consumers and assist them to make safe choices when selecting a practitioner to perform their surgery. And so what this reform has done is amended the national law to only allow medical practitioners who hold specialist registration either in surgery, obstetrics and gynecology, or ophthalmology to call themselves a surgeon. And so doctors who don't hold specialist registration in those areas can no longer use the term title. And so all references to, can't use the title surgeon. So all references to surgeon must be removed from all advertising now that this has come into effect. And so one of the commonly asked questions is, well, does a cosmetic surgery endorsement allow a practitioner to call themselves a cosmetic surgeon? And the answer is no. It allows the practitioner to say that they hold an endorsement in cosmetic surgery, but they still can't call themselves a surgeon. And so as you can see from this slide, there are some not insignificant penalties associated with breaches of these provisions of the national law. So $60,000 fine or 3 years imprisonment or both. And so just the last slide that I would like to speak to is where to in the future. So it's been really interesting to observe, the significant reforms that have taken place in this space in a relatively short period of time. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the work that the regulators have done in under 2 years would normally take, probably 4 or 5 years to enact and to execute. But there's still other reform or other changes that have been made to processes that I haven't touched on, but also there's further reforms in the pipeline. And so two important ones, first of all, relate to non-surgical cosmetic procedures. And so this builds on the reforms that have already been enacted in relation to cosmetic surgery. but this seeks to regulate non-cosmetic surgical procedures performed by other registered health practitioners other than medical practitioners. And so the medical board, the national boards and AHPRA recently consulted on a number of documents. There were some draft guidelines for nurses and draft guidelines for other registered health practitioners that perform non-surgical cosmetic procedures, as well as advertising guidelines for other health practitioners as well. And just the last area of proposed reform is also a response to the Royal Commission into sexual abuse that is part of a response to trying to tighten regulation in respect of sexual misconduct. And so it seeks to strengthen protections for notifiers and prospective notifiers. And so these are amendments that the health ministers are proposing that will make it clear that signing a non-disclosure agreement doesn't prevent that person from making a notification to a regulator under the national law. And it also seeks to make it an offence to seek to bar somebody from making a notification under the national law within a non-disclosure agreement. And this also stems from the independent review into cosmetic surgery that found that the use of these non-disclosure agreements can interfere with consumers' understanding about their rights in relation to making notifications, and that this can ultimately compromise patient safety by undermining efforts to create a strong reporting culture. And so that brings me to the end of my presentation. But I guess just to reiterate that, I mean, I've found it quite a fascinating journey to have been following these reforms over time. I remember when I began working in medical defence insurance and seeing, descriptions and photographs of some of the types of claims that were coming through and thinking about how the area and the system could be reformed. I think the challenge is always about trying to strike the right balance. Bearing in mind, of course, that the overwhelming majority of practitioners want to do the right thing and do the right thing. And so a big challenge for us as medical defence insurers has been, helping practitioners navigate what are some really complex regulatory and legislative reforms. So that's enough from me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm more than happy to take any questions after Alisha's presentation.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Owen. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be with you today. So my name is Alisha. I am a research officer at Monash University's Body Image and Eating Disorder Research Group. So as the name suggests, our research explores the causes, impacts, treatment, etc. of eating disorders and other body image related issues. So one part of that research does look at the mental health of patients in a cosmetic setting, and we have recently been involved in some exciting new projects in this space, which I will share more about later on. So as Owen has wonderfully taken you through all the reforms, I am going to just go into more detail about the importance of assessing the mental health of cosmetic patients and how this has been incorporated into the new practice guidelines. And as Owen mentioned, body dysmorphic disorder, or BDD, is the one mental health condition that is explicitly explored in the reforms. So this is where I'll be focusing today. Also more than happy to take on any questions after, and I will do my best at answering, but I am purely a researcher, not a practicing psychologist currently. So if you have more clinical questions that I can't answer, I can absolutely connect you with other people within my research group. So as Owen has gone through, cosmetic procedures are becoming increasingly popular. An estimated $1 billion is spent in Australia each year alone. There was an interesting survey recently that found 38% of Australian adults were considering a cosmetic intervention in the next 10 years. So this is huge. It's rapidly growing. That's why in recent years, a lot more attention has been given to cosmetic practices. And a big area of interest or concern has been the mental health of patients, both pre and post procedure. So starting with the basics before we get into the extremities, thinking about pre-cosmetic intervention, mental health is important to understand in this population, as body image concerns are the most common motivation for seeking cosmetic intervention. So body image refers to one's thoughts, feelings, perceptions about their body. So body image is not just the reality of how a person looks, it's the individual's perception of how they look. And we all know that perceptions and reality are not always the same. That is why in some cases, people can sometimes seek cosmetic intervention for things that we don't think are necessary. Some examples of body image concerns could be disliking the shape or size of your nose or lips, feeling insecure about eye wrinkles. There are endless body image concerns that people may have. They are very personal to each person, and they're also heavily influenced by external influences like other people and what we see in the media. So that brings us to body dysmorphic disorder, or BDD. BDD does involve or start with body image concerns, but it goes far beyond that. So I'll take you through what exactly it is, and we can look at the impacts it has in a cosmetic setting too. So a person can have a body image concern that others don't think is really concerning. That doesn't necessarily mean they have BDD. BDD is diagnosed when this diagnostic criteria is met. So in that blue box, you'll find the key diagnostic criteria for BDD. Patients with BDD will exhibit a significantly distressing or impairing preoccupation with a perceived defect or flaw in their appearance, despite this flaw not being observable or significant to others. Then, as a result of this excessive appearance concern, the individual will perform either repetitive behaviours or mental acts. So this could be repetitively checking themselves in the mirror, comparing themselves to others, excessive exercise, using clothes, makeup, or other accessories to hide or camouflage the area of concern. The list goes on. A final example I will highlight is that some may change their food consumption in order to combat their appearance concern. So looking at criteria D, in patients that also meet an eating disorder criteria, their preoccupying appearance concern is not better explained by a concern in body fat or weight. So if the patient is preoccupied with overall body fat or weight and is meeting the criteria for an eating disorder, although there are similarities with BDD, this is not BDD, this is an eating disorder. So I can give you some examples of how people with BDD may present in a cosmetic setting. One example could be a patient could come in who is really concerned with acne scars. So they do have scars, but they're really subtle. So the cosmetic practitioner didn't even initially see them when the patient came in. The patient may have grown their hair very long to cover as much of the scars as possible. They could apply multiple layers of makeup daily in order to hide those scars. They constantly mirror check, and the family reports that they excessively ask for their opinion on the visibility of the scars. Another example could be a patient may have previously had rhinoplasty and is now seeking another. So they were happy with the results at the time of the first procedure, but 6 months later started to notice that the shape wasn't perfectly symmetrical. The practitioner may take their measurements and show them that, in fact, their nose is symmetrical, but the patient could still be adamant that it's not right and they need a second surgery. So they are just some examples, some obvious examples, but of course, the presentation of BDD can widely vary and not always be so obvious to detect. BDD has, it's been at the forefront of research in cosmetic patients as it's so highly prevalent. An Australian study recently looked at the prevalence of BDD in minor cosmetic procedure patients. They found that on a BDD screening tool, 25% of patients screened positive. The specific prevalence rates do vary between studies, but the number is always huge. 25% is massive. There is no argument that BDD is very, very overrepresented in cosmetic patients. So, why is it important to understand it in a cosmetic setting? It's because of the array of different ways that BDD can impact the outcomes of cosmetic procedures. As you can see on this slide, there are two sides to this story. There has been contrasting findings and research regarding the impacts of BDD. So across some research, including that from our own body image and eating disorder research group, BDD symptoms were found to improve following cosmetic intervention. This was also associated then with greater self-image and improved self-esteem. However, a substantial amount of evidence has found the opposite. Following cosmetic intervention, patients with BDD may experience even worse symptoms, and they're more likely to be dissatisfied with the treatment. So dissatisfaction can then lead to a range of negative outcomes listed on the screen there, such as requests for additional procedures, distress, adjustment, social and relationship difficulties, anger towards staff, and there is a heightened risk of suicide as well. So how do we know if a patient with BDD is going to experience these positive outcomes or these alarmingly negative ones? This is not fully understood yet. One possible explanation is that it depends on the severity and nature of their BDD symptoms. So for patients with mild symptoms or a concern that's localized to one body part, they may experience these positive outcomes, whereas patients with more severe symptoms are very unlikely to see improvements and are much more likely to experience this array of negative outcomes. So the complexity of BDD in a cosmetic setting just highlights the need for psychologists to be involved. Where any BDD symptoms are suspected, comprehensive assessment by a mental health professional is going to help determine the likely outcomes and therefore the best course of action. And that's what the new guidelines have tried to ensure happens. So let's look at the new standards and guidelines, mainly focusing just on the guidelines that relate to BDD and mental health concerns in general. So, in response to the review, Owen introduced us to the new standards and guidelines were introduced last year for cosmetic practitioners. So these are the practice guidelines. So in particular, the new guidelines from the Medical Board of Australia, they've tried to foster that collaboration with mental health professionals that I mentioned the importance of before. So on the screen, I've only put snippets of the guidelines that are relevant to the psychological side of things. So the standards, they specify that each patient's psychological health needs to be considered when determining their suitability. But it's these guidelines that really help us narrow down exactly what we're looking for and what needs to be done. So guidelines 2.4 and 2.5 are the focus for psychologists. We have looked at the potential negative outcomes for those with BDD. So it comes as no surprise that the guidelines have specified that BDD must be screened for by the cosmetic practitioner. If BDD or any other psychological condition that may impact the procedure are suspected or identified, a referral to a mental health professional is necessary. So the mental health professional will be able to provide a much more comprehensive assessment that focuses on best addressing the patient's concerns. So they work independently from the cosmetic practitioner. So the mental health professional may consider other treatments such as therapy in their recommendation. So BDD is vital to screen for, but you will notice that these guidelines don't say if BDD is indicated, it says if any psychological issue is indicated. There are many more mental health concerns that may significantly impact the outcomes of cosmetic procedures that we also hope to bring attention to. I won't spend too much time here because the focus today is BDD, but here are some other psychological conditions that may impact the outcomes of cosmetic procedures. These are also highlighted and discussed in the Australian Psychological Society's guidelines for psychologists completing the assessments. So these were released in 2023 as well to coincide with the new guidelines. My supervisor and the lead of the Body Image and Eating Disorder Research Group, Associate Professor Gemma Sharp, was one of the lead authors of these guidelines, so we know them well. BDD is absolutely thoroughly explored in these guidelines, but all of these mental health disorders on the screen are also examined as they also have the potential to impact cosmetic procedures. Whilst the impacts may vary between mental health concerns, there are some overarching impacts that apply to all. So any pre-existing mental health concern increases the likelihood that the patient will experience dissatisfaction and poorer outcomes similar to those discussed for BDD. There is a general consensus that mental health symptoms will not be improved by cosmetic intervention. So whilst BDD is the focus today and the focus of the new guidelines, there is a much larger range of psychological conditions that are relevant to this population and that mental health professionals are looking for when conducting these assessments. So now we know what psychologists or other mental health professionals are looking for. Just give you a brief idea about what exactly that entails. So what happens when a mental health professional completes an assessment for a cosmetic patient? As we just discussed, psychologists will be thoroughly assessing the patient for any signs of mental health concerns. This is a comprehensive process. The psychologist will not simply categorize patients as suitable or unsuitable, but rather will provide recommendations for the best course of action to appropriately and most effectively address the patient's concerns. So some cosmetic practitioners do worry that referring patients for psychological assessment will result in them being ruled out for cosmetic intervention. However, the mental health professional is simply providing recommendations, not a decision. The cosmetic practitioner is ultimately making the decision to provide the cosmetic procedure, taking into consideration the professional opinion of the psychologist. Furthermore, psychologists will very rarely assess a patient as entirely unsuitable for cosmetic intervention. Most often they are able to proceed, or it's recommended that the patient complete other interventions such as psychological therapy before undergoing the procedure. And yeah, whilst BDD is generally considered a contraindication for cosmetic procedures, we also saw how some people with mild BDD symptoms may experience positive outcomes. And there's not enough research yet to rule out any of those other mental health disorders. So even when a mental health disorder is identified, it doesn't necessarily mean that the patient cannot receive their cosmetic request. Psychologists will recommend what they think is best to address the patient's needs and concerns. And it's also important for cosmetic practitioners to be aware so that they can make appropriate accommodations. But I suppose that's where the ethical question comes in. When should or shouldn't patients with mental health concerns be allowed to complete their cosmetic requests? Okay, just to sum up, ultimately, the new guidelines do aim to foster collaboration between cosmetic practitioners and psychologists to optimize patient outcomes, and completing these more comprehensive psychological assessments before patients undergo cosmetic intervention aims to protect the interests of both the patient and the cosmetic practitioner. We are also aiming to foster collaboration within our research group. So we're in the process of developing a short course in collaboration with the Cosmetic Physicians College of Australasia. This course aims to educate cosmetic practitioners on the new standards and guidelines as they relate to mental health, and upskill them on the importance and the actual process of mental health assessment in their patients. So if you are interested, or anyone you work with is interested in learning more about this course as it becomes available, feel free to scan that QR code on the screen and leave your details. The course is in final stages of development, so we're hoping to release it sometime next month. That is all from me. Thank you so much for listening. Yeah, today's presentation is quite quick, but I hope that gave you a bit of insight into the psychological perspective of cosmetic procedures. If you have any questions or queries beyond today, feel free to take note of my email on the screen. And for more clinical questions, also feel free to reach out to my supervisor and lead of our research group there, Associate Professor Gemma Sharp. Thank you, guys.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Alisha. That was really, really good. And thank you to Owen as well. Two really interesting talks. And we'll be back next month for another Hello Health Law and Ethics seminar. So please look out for your emails for further details about that. All right. Thank you all.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.